Dust Road hauntings. The flashlight beam trembled across the basement floor, illuminating what remained of Duke Calder. His skin was gone, not torn, not burned, removed with surgical precision that left every muscle fiber exposed, glistening wet, under the harsh white light. His body lay folded into an unnatural position against the concrete wall, arms bent backward at angles that defied anatomy, mouth frozen open in a silent scream that would never end. Elias Mercer stood paralyzed in the doorway, the smell hitting him like a physical wall. Copper and rot and something else, something sweet, like overripe fruit left to decay in summer heat. 3 days ago, Duke had been laughing over burned coffee at a truck stop outside Odessa. 3 days ago, they'd made a stupid decision to explore an abandoned building. 3 days ago, Elias had awakened something that should have stayed buried. And now, that something was hunting them all. Before we begin, I want to thank every soul that keeps returning to listen. You've turned whispers into echoes. If you haven't already, subscribe and stay close, because what you're about to hear is one story you won't forget. 72 hours earlier, the CB radio crackled with static as Elias Mercer guided his Peterbilt 389 along the endless ribbon of Highway 285. West Texas stretched around him in every direction, flat, brown, and utterly indifferent to human existence. The afternoon sun had baked the landscape into something that looked more like Mars than Earth. Heat shimmers dancing above the asphalt like restless ghosts. Elias had been running freight across these roads for 11 years. Specialty cargo mostly, equipment too sensitive for rail, materials too valuable for standard shipping. The money was good. The solitude was better. At 43, he'd made peace with the fact that his cab was more home than any apartment would ever be. The radio popped again, and a familiar voice cut through the interference. "Mercer, you copy? This is Duke. Got eyes on your tail about 6 miles back." Elias keyed the mic. "Copy that, Duke. Thought you were running the Amarillo route this week." "Changed my mind. Heard something interesting on Channel 19 last night. You near the Pecos exit?" 20 minutes out. "Why?" A pause. Then Duke's voice dropped lower, the way it always did when he had information he shouldn't. "Pull off at the Flying J. Marlin, and Sophie are already there. There's something I need to show you boys." The Flying J truck stop materialized out of the heat haze like an oasis. Fuel pumps, a diner with grease-filmed windows, and a parking lot populated by 18-wheelers arranged in neat rows. Elias found a spot near the back and killed the engine. The sudden silence almost painful after hours of road noise. Duke Calder was waiting by the entrance, cigarette dangling from his lips. At 56, he looked like a man the desert had tried to kill and failed. Leathery skin, sun-squinted eyes, and hands that had seen more steering wheels than most people saw in 3 lifetimes. Beside him stood Marlin Ortiz, younger and quieter, with a kind of watchful demeanor that came from growing up in places where attention meant survival. Sophie Vance was inside, nursing a cup of coffee that looked like it had been sitting too long. She was the only female long-hauler Elias knew personally, sharp-tongued, sharper-minded, and possessed of an encyclopedic knowledge of every forgotten road between El Paso and Lubbock. "All right," Elias said, sliding into the booth across from her. "What's this about?" Duke spread a worn paper map across the table. Actual paper, which meant whatever he'd found wasn't something he wanted traceable through GPS history. His finger tapped a spot about 15 miles off the main highway where the map showed nothing but empty land. Silas Marsh Junior High, Duke said. Closed down in 1987. Buildings still standing, but barely. Word on the CB is that some drivers have been seeing lights out there at night. Moving lights. And sounds. What kind of sounds? Sophie asked. Duke's jaw tightened. Clicking, like insects. But big insects. Marlin shifted uncomfortably. There's more. Trucker named Hank Bessemer went out there 2 weeks ago. Wanted to see what the fuss was about. He paused. Nobody's heard from him since. His rig was found on the shoulder of 285, engine still running, cab empty, no signs of struggle, just gone. Elias studied the map. The location sat in the middle of absolute nowhere. No towns, no ranches, nothing but scrubland and silence. The kind of place where a person could disappear and the desert would swallow every trace within a season. You want to check it out, he said. It wasn't a question. Duke's eyes glittered. I want to know what took Hank. He was a good man. Ran clean cargo, never cheated a way station, always had your back if you broke down in the middle of nowhere. His voice hardened. Whatever happened to him, it wasn't an accident, and I don't like mysteries. Sophie drained her coffee. I'm in, but we go during daylight. We stay together, and if anything feels wrong, we leave. No heroics. Marlin nodded slowly. Same, but I'm bringing my shotgun. They all looked at Elias. He should have said no. Every instinct honed by a decade of desert driving screamed at him to walk away, to climb back in his cab and put 500 miles between himself and whatever waited in that abandoned school. But Hank Bessemer had once driven through a thunderstorm to bring Elias a replacement alternator when his truck died outside Midland. That kind of debt didn't disappear just because the man who was owed it had vanished. Tomorrow morning, Elias said. First light, and we bring everything. Flashlights, water, weapons, first aid, if this goes sideways. I want options. Duke grinned, but there was no humor in it. That's my boy. Outside the diner windows, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of blood and rust. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that seemed to hang in the air long after it should have faded. None of them noticed the figure standing motionless beside the fuel pumps, watching their table with eyes that caught the dying light and held it far too long. The convoy rolled out at 6:15 the next morning, 4 trucks moving in formation along roads that grew progressively worse the further they traveled from the highway. Elias led the way, his GPS useless this far off the grid, navigating instead by Duke's hand-drawn directions and the occasional rusted mile marker. The landscape shifted as they drove. From scrubland to something starker, a terrain of cracked earth and skeletal vegetation that looked like it hadn't seen meaningful rain in years. The sky above was a washed-out blue, empty of clouds, empty of birds, empty of everything except the relentless sun. Silas Marsh Junior High appeared without warning, rising from the desert floor like a fever dream. The building was larger than Elias had expected, a 2-story structure of weathered brick and shattered windows, surrounded by what had once been a parking lot, but was now a graveyard of crumbling asphalt and wind-blown debris. A rusted flagpole stood at the entrance, bare metal, creaking in a breeze that Elias couldn't feel. They parked in a rough semicircle, engines idling, nobody moving to exit. "Well," Sophie said over the radio, "that's definitely not abandoned." She was right. Fresh tire tracks cut through the dust, leading to the building's side entrance. Recent tracks, maybe a day old at most. Duke was first out of his cab, shotgun already in hand. "Someone's been here, recently." "Could be scrappers," Marlin offered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Lot of copper in old buildings like this." "Scrappers don't drive out here," Elias said, stepping down from his truck. The air outside was brutally hot and carried a smell he couldn't identify. Something organic, something wrong. Too far from anywhere to fence materials. Doesn't make financial sense. They approached the building as a group, flashlights, ready despite the daylight. The main entrance was chained shut, but the side door hung open on broken hinges, darkness visible beyond. The interior was worse than the exterior suggested. Sand had drifted through broken windows, forming small dunes in the hallways. Ceiling tiles hung like diseased skin, exposing pipes and wiring that had long since been stripped. Lockers lined the walls, most standing open, their contents decayed beyond recognition. And everywhere, on the walls, the floors, the remaining classroom doors, were symbols, not graffiti, not the random tags of bored teenagers. These were deliberate, painted in something dark and rust-colored that Elias refused to examine too closely. Geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, circles within circles within circles, intersected by lines that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. "What the hell is this?" Sophie whispered. Duke photographed one of the larger symbols with his phone, flash illuminating details that made Elias's stomach clench. Some kind of cult marking. Seen something similar once, outside Roswell. Local cops said it was Satanist garbage, but they never found who was responsible. "These aren't Satanist," Marlin said quietly. He was standing before a wall covered in smaller symbols, his expression unreadable. "My grandmother used to tell stories about marks like these. Old stories. She called them hunger signs. Warnings that something in the land had woken up and needed to be fed." A sound echoed from deeper in the building, soft, rhythmic, click, click, click. Everyone froze. "Basement," Duke said, already moving. "That came from below us." "Wait," Elias started, but Duke was through the nearest doorway, shotgun raised, flashlight cutting through the darkness. They found the stairs behind what had once been the administrative office. Concrete steps descended into absolute blackness, the smell from before growing stronger with each step down. Copper and rot and that sickly sweetness that coated the back of Elias's throat. The clicking continued. Louder now. Closer. Duke reached the bottom first and stopped so suddenly that Elias nearly collided with him. "Jesus Christ," Duke breathed. The basement was large. Some kind of combined boiler room and storage area. And it had been transformed. A massive pentagram had been burned into the concrete floor, the lines still faintly warm to the touch. Candles surrounded the shape, hundreds of them, their wax pooling into grotesque formations. And at the center was a hole, not a natural formation, not construction damage, a carved opening in the earth itself, perhaps 10 feet across, descending into darkness so complete that their flashlights couldn't penetrate it. The clicking sound rose from that hole in waves, accompanied now by something else. A wet, dragging noise like meat being pulled across stone. "We need to go," Sophie said. "Right now. Right now." Movement in the darkness, not from the hole, from behind them. Elias spun, flashlight beam sweeping across the basement's far corners, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Figures. 6 of them, maybe 7, standing motionless against the walls. They wore robes, dark, shapeless garments that covered them from head to foot. But their postures were wrong. Their limbs bent at odd angles. Their heads tilted too far to one side. Their bodies swaying slightly in a rhythm that matched the clicking from the pit. One of them stepped forward, and the movement was nauseating to watch. It didn't walk. It twitched, each motion segmented and jerky, like a puppet controlled by an inexperienced hand. Its face was hidden beneath a deep hood, but Elias caught a glimpse of something pale and glistening where features should have been. "You have come," the figure said, and its voice was a chorus, dozens of tones layered over each other, none of them human. "You have seen. The breed wakes. The breed hungers." Duke's shotgun roared, the muzzle flash blinding in the darkness. The figure stumbled backward but didn't fall, didn't bleed, simply righted itself with that horrible twitching motion and continued forward. "Run!" Elias screamed. They ran. Up the stairs, through the corridors, past the symbols that seemed to writhe in the edges of their vision. Behind them, the clicking swelled into a cacophony, joined by the sound of many footsteps, too many footsteps, pursuing them through the building. Sophie reached the exit first, bursting into sunlight that felt weak and insufficient. Marlin followed, then Elias, then Duke, who turned at the threshold and fired twice more into the darkness before sprinting toward the trucks. The engines caught. Tires spun on broken asphalt. The convoy fled, leaving Silas Marsh Junior High shrinking in their mirrors. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped, that something had followed, that in the moment he'd stood at the edge of that pit and stared into the darkness had stared back and recognized him. That night, alone in his cab at a rest stop, 50 miles from where he should have felt safe, Elias heard it for the first time. Click, 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 coming from directly beneath his trailer. 3 days passed, 3 days of jumping at shadows, of checking mirrors obsessively, of sleeping in shifts at well-lit truck stops surrounded by other drivers. The clicking had stopped after that first night, but its absence was somehow worse, like a predator that had gone silent because it no longer needed to announce its presence. Elias rented a small ranch house outside Pecos for his mandatory rest period. The property was isolated, nearest neighbor over a mile away, but it had walls and locks and the comforting illusion of security. He spent the first evening cleaning his truck, checking the trailer seals, trying to convince himself that what they'd seen in that basement had been some kind of mass hallucination brought on by heat and stress. The knock came just after midnight. Elias was watching television, sound low, when the pounding started. 3 heavy blows against the front door that rattled the frame. He muted the TV, listening. The knocking came again, accompanied by a voice. Please, my car broke down on the highway. I've been walking for hours. I just need to use your phone." Male voice. Desperate. Frightened. Elias moved to the window beside the door and peered through the gap in the curtains. A man stood on the porch, mid-30s, wearing clothes that looked too thin for the desert night, face partially obscured by shadow. His posture was wrong, tilted slightly forward, arms hanging at angles that suggested joints had been reassembled incorrectly. "Please," the man said again, and his mouth didn't quite sync with the words. "I'm so cold, I'm so hungry. Won't you let me in?" Elias stepped back from the window, hand moving to the pistol holstered at his hip. "I've already called the police. They're on their way. There's a gas station 3 miles east. They can help you." Silence. Then the man on the porch laughed. A wet, bubbling sound that seemed to come from too many throats at once. "You saw us," the voice said, and it was different now, layered, harmonizing with itself. "You looked into the breeding pit. The breed sees you now, Elias Mercer. The breed knows your shape." The door shuddered as something heavy threw itself against it. Once, twice. The wood around the lock began to splinter. Elias fired through the door, 3 shots, center mass, and the assault stopped. He heard footsteps retreating, then silence. 15 minutes later, a Pecos County Sheriff's deputy arrived, responding to the shots fired call. They found nothing on the porch except a dark stain that the deputy said was probably motor oil. No footprints, no sign of the stranger. "Probably just some vagrant," the deputy said, not quite meeting Elias's eyes. "We get them sometimes, wandering in from the desert. Heat does strange things to people out here." Elias didn't argue. What could he say? That a cult member from an abandoned school had tracked him across 50 miles of desert? That the man on his porch had moved like a broken marionette and spoke with a voice that belonged in nightmares? The deputy left. Elias sat in his kitchen, pistol on the table, lights blazing in every room. At 3:47 a.m., the scratching started. Not at the front door, the back door. The one that led to a small patio, and beyond that, nothing but empty desert. The sound was soft at first, almost gentle, like a dog wanting to be let in. Then it intensified. Nails, or claws, dragging across the wooden door in long, deliberate strokes. Elias raised his pistol, aimed at the door's center, and called out, "I'm armed. Leave now, or I will shoot." The scratching stopped, and then something spoke from the other side, something using his own voice. "Please," it said, perfectly mimicking his cadence, his tone, even the slight rasp he got when he was tired. "Please, my car broke down on the highway. I've been walking for hours. I just need to use your phone." The words dissolved into that wet, layered laughter. Elias's hand trembled on the pistol grip. "We wear your shapes," the thing outside continued. And now the voice was shifting, cycling through different tones. Duke's voice, Sophie's voice, Marlin's voice. Voices Elias didn't recognize. "We eat your skins and become. The breed is patient. The breed is everywhere. And you woke us." The scratching resumed, lower on the door now, accompanied by a wet sound. Something pressing against the wood, testing its strength. Elias fired. The bullet punched through the door and was answered by a shriek, high-pitched and inhuman, trailing off into a series of clicks that faded into the desert night. When dawn came, Elias examined the back entrance. The door was covered in deep gouges, the wood shredded in patterns that looked almost like writing, and on the ground beneath the window, a piece of skin, human skin, roughly the size of a palm, curled at the edges like parchment. It was still fresh, still glistening, and on its surface, visible in the harsh morning light, was a tattoo. A small anchor, the kind sailors got. Hank Bessemer had been Navy before he became a trucker. Hank Bessemer had that exact tattoo on his left forearm,